Welcome to another edition of Cracking the IR Code with Stacie. I am Stacie Buck, President and Senior Consultant of RadRx. So for this week's case, I have chosen a head and neck angiography case. We're looking at code range 36221 through 36228. And these cases seem to be very intimidating to medical coders, but I actually feel like these are some of the easier procedures to code for the fact that we have both the catheterization work and also the imaging that is bundled into one surgical code. So we have fewer codes than if we had to code them separately. And then also the coding hierarchy is pretty straightforward, with lesser codes being bundled into higher codes when we are applying them. Now, this report here actually is broken down pretty nicely in that in the first section of the report, we have a list of all of the vessels catheterized. And then below that, it says vessels imaged, selective angiograms were performed at all selective catheter placements. So when I code cases like these that have all that information at the top of the report, what I actually do is I will go through and I will assign all of the codes based on what is documented in these first two sections. And then after I do that, then I will read through the rest of the report and I will determine whether or not the rest of the documentation actually supports selection of those codes. Now, we can clearly assign codes based on the vessels that are catheterized. And if imaging was done of all of them, then we're good to go. We have everything that we need. But it is possible that sometimes in the reports that when you dig into the actual findings, that you may see that there are not findings to support imaging occurring in all those vessels. So that's what we're going to need to verify in this report. So we see all the vessels catheterized listed: the left subclavian, left vertebral, left costocervical, left deep cervical, left thyrocervical, left ascending cervical, left common carotid, left internal carotid, left external carotid, right common carotid, right internal carotid artery, right external carotid artery, and right vertebral. So the site of access will not affect the particular codes in this case. It is highlighted, it is at the right common femoral artery, but it is not going to factor into our code selection. We see in that fourth section that's highlighted in blue, again, it's just reiterating where the catheter was placed. First, it went into the aortic arch. Then from there, it went into all of the vessels that are listed under the vessels catheterized. So I'm not going to read through all those, but we have a match on those two sections. So again, we have confirmation that the catheter was placed in all of those vessels. Now you'll see that I have a section highlighted in gray that says diagnostic catheter into the distal left vertebral artery. That is not mentioned in the vessels catheterized above because it is still in the vertebral artery. So because the catheter just went into the distal left vertebral that was already catheterized and it didn't come out of the vertebral and go into another vessel, we don't have anything additional to code for that. So mainly what we want to do here, because we already know where the catheter was placed and then imaging was done supposedly from all these catheter placements, we want to go through and make sure that we have an interpretation for all of the vessels that have been listed. So we know that this left subclavian artery was catheterized. And so when we go down to the interpretation of films section, we see left subclavian arteriography results. That is looking at the proximal portion of the vessel, and then also the origin of the left vertebral artery is noted. Then from there, the catheter went into the left vertebral, and we see here that we have findings for the left vertebral angiography that occurred. Then when we go over onto the next page, in that one sentence at the top there, we have four vessels that are bundled together. We have the left costocervical, left deep cervical, left thyrocervical, and left ascending cervical arteriography. And it says that all of those are normal. So we do have findings documented for all four of those vessels. Then when we move further, we're going to verify that we do have findings for the left common carotid. We also have findings for the left internal carotid. We also have findings for the left external carotid, as well as the right common carotid, right internal carotid, right external carotid, and right vertebral. So we have findings that match every single catheter placement that is noted on that first page. So now we have all of the information that we need to assign our codes. We need to know, one, where is the catheter placed? And then two, what was imaged from the catheter placement? So walking through the logic of coding this particular case, we're going to go back to this interpretation section and we're going to look here. So the first catheter placement was in the left subclavian. And at that time, when the catheter went in the left subclavian to do the evaluation, that would be a code 36225. But because the catheter didn't stop there, the catheter went into the left vertebral artery. Now, the catheterization in the subclavian was for purposes of evaluating the vertebral. That's why that was a 36225. The catheter goes into the left vertebral now. It has moved into the vertebral artery itself. This now becomes code 36226, and then code 36225 is going to be bundled with 36226. So the difference between the two codes, 36225, is catheter placed in the subclavian for imaging of the vertebral artery, and then 36226 is catheter placed in the vertebral artery for imaging, and then 36226 is the higher code in the hierarchy, so that is assigned alone for the imaging that occurred of the left vertebral. Now I'm going to skip for right now the left costocervical, left deep cervical, left thyrocervical, those vessels. I'm going to come back to those in a moment. I want to continue on and jump down to the section that mentions the left common carotid and then the left internal carotid. So here what happened, the catheter first went into the left common carotid for imaging to occur. So at that point in time, we see with the left common carotid arteriogram, when the catheter was placed there, the physician commented on both the common carotid artery and, commented on the cervical segment of the left internal carotid artery. So that actually would be a 36222 at that point in time. But the physician didn't stop with the catheter placement there. The catheter made it into that left internal carotid. So now when the catheter is in the left internal carotid for study of the left internal carotid, that becomes a 36224, which then bundles that 36222 that occurred. So on the left side right now, the two codes that we have assigned are 36224 for the left internal carotid imaging, and then 36226 for the left vertebral imaging. Now let's jump down to the next section where it mentions left external carotid arteriography. So we know that the catheter went into the left external carotid for imaging. So that will be a 36227, which is an add-on code. It's important to note with code 36227 that this code is an add-on code. It can only be assigned with a base code. And also with the left external carotid code 36227, even when multiple branches are catheterized of the external carotid, 36227 is assigned only one time per side. So that's something you want to remember. So now on the left, we have our 36227 in addition to our 36224 and our 36226. When we go over to the right, the physician did the same work on the right. We first started in the right common carotid with imaging, then went to the right internal carotid with imaging, then on to the right external carotid and the right vertebral. So that means that we're going to have the same codes on the right as we do on the left. So we have bilateral 36226, bilateral 36227, and bilateral 36224. Now I'm going to go up to the paragraph on the top of this page where it mentions the left costocervical, the left deep cervical, the left thyrocervical, and the left ascending cervical arteriography that was performed. So all of these vessels come directly off of the left subclavian. So how this works is you have the left costocervical that is going to come directly off of the subclavian. Then from there, that left deep cervical is going to come off of the left costocervical. And then the left thyrocervical, that comes directly off of the subclavian. And then that gives way to the left ascending cervical artery there. So we have two vessels directly off of the subclavian that are being catheterized, and then the catheter is actually moving beyond each of those second order vessels into the third order vessels. So these are coded a little bit oddly, as you'll see. I'm actually going to flip over to the code sheet here as I explain this to you. You'll see that I've assigned 36218 and 36218 for the imaging that was just discussed in paragraph 4. So we had 4 vessels catheterized. So why are we only assigning 2 catheterization codes? So the reason for that is, again, the left costocervical trunk that actually gives way to that deep cervical. So we're on the same path. We've moved from the subclavian first order into a left costocervical trunk second order into the left deep cervical, which is going to be a third order. So that's the furthest destination on the path. Then the catheter gets pulled back. Then it goes over into the left thyrocervical, which is a second order, then goes into the ascending cervical, which is a third order. So that is the furthest catheter destination on that path. So that's why we have 2 catheterization codes, because we have only 2 branches that were third order catheterizations. Now, it may look odd to you to have code 36218 assigned here because it falls out of the norm of what we do. Typically, when you assign a 36218, you've already assigned a 36216 or a 36217. Now, generally speaking, 36218 is not going to be used in conjunction with codes 36221 through 36228. There is an exception to when you will see it with these codes, and that is what you see here in this example. The fact that we are doing catheter work in imaging off of the subclavian to evaluate these other vessels, the add-on code is used, because, and our base code for these in this instance would be the 36226. So this is something that you want to remember, whether or not to use the 36218 and also the 75774, which I'll get to in just a moment. If you are looking at one of these cases and you have already assigned code 36226 or 36225 for a particular side, once either one of those codes has been assigned, any of these vessels that you're going to do catheterization and imaging of that are off of that subclavian, those are going to be coded with a 36218 and a 75774. If you don't do any vertebral imaging, you do not assign a 36225 or a 36226, then these vessels are going to be coded with the regular catheterization codes. So it would be 36217 would be for the first one, 36218 would be for the second one, and then your imaging, you would actually code it with the extremity code for the first imaging that occurs, 75710, and then for each additional vessel, you would use your add-on code. But that's not what occurred here, because vertebral imaging occurred first off of that subclavian. You are going to use add-on codes 36218. So again, we have 2 branches that were catheterized, third order branches. So we're going to use add-on code 36218 for each of those. And then for imaging, you get to assign an imaging code for each vessel that was imaged. And we know that all 4 are imaged. And again, because we've used code 36226 for the vertebral angiography in this case, once we do that, then any of these other vessels off of the subclavian will be reported with 75774 for the imaging. So again, depending upon whether or not the vertebral imaging is done is going to affect the coding of the complete case. So in review, I'm going to read through the comments to review the points. So remember, code 3622650 is assigned for bilateral vertebral imaging. Then we have 36225 that's assigned for the bilateral internal carotid imaging. And then we have 36227 modifier 50, which is for the bilateral external carotid imaging. And then here's that written explanation for what I just mentioned about using the 36218 with the 75774, because that can be confusing sometimes for coders. So again, since just highlighting the second part of that, since 36226 was assigned for the vertebral study, the add-on code should be used for the additional vascular families, our 36218 and then our 75774. So again, if the 36226 had not been assigned in this case, then that would change the coding of the ascending cervical and deep cervical to 36217, 36218, and then the imaging would be 75710, and then 75774 times 3. So always very important to pay attention to the details in the report. And if you have any questions on this case, if you're still confused about how those codes work together, feel free to drop any questions below in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks for joining, and I'll be back in 2 weeks with another case.